Hey everyone, Rose here, and I've been sculpting again. Today's video is actually the first part of a short series. I was commissioned via Twitter to make a full character model of this here character, Plushmellow. In this video, I'll be showing you my process for the base sculpt, and in the future there'll be one on retopology and one on the materials. For this model, I'm working in the full released version of Blender, not in the experimental builds, because since it's a commission, I don't want to risk anything being like corrupted or anything crashing. I'm also only using default tools that come with Blender, so I didn't download any extra add-ons or anything like that. With all that out of the way, onto the sculpt. I start the model out with the basic blocking. I add in some spheres and shape them into the very basic forms for the head and torso, and then I do the legs and arms. For that I add a single vert, extrude it out, add a skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier, as well as a mirror modifier that I've set to mirror around the torso. I can now just go in edit mode and adjust the thickness with Ctrl A and also duplicate the whole setup over to make the arms. I've been using this setup in a lot of my recent sculpts and it's super practical. I also separate out the limbs into separate parts to make it easier to pose and manipulate. Now I duplicate the head into the general shape of the mane as well as the snout, and I make another skin modifier setup for the ears, the tail, and the horns. This blocking stage is super important early on because that way you can make sure all the proportions and stuff are right, while you still have multiple objects that are set up in a way that makes them super easy to manipulate and adjust. Once you've merged everything together and started adding detail, it's really hard to adjust all these major proportion issues and you can end up with a really wonky model. With all the major parts in place, I add the toes, which are just a basic cube with a subdivision surface modifier and a bit of box modeling. At this point I also make sure my origins are at the joints and my objects are parented together, that way I can more easily tweak the pose. Now I add a little floofy bit at the end of the tail, again with my skin modifier stuff, and adjust the proportions and the length of the arms a bit. I also add a little blob for the hands and then add the claw finger things he has. Again, for these I use my whole skin modifier stuff. From here I continue to adjust the proportions and everything until I'm happy with how he looks. I have PureRef open on my other screen with some more art of the character, so that way I can keep checking to make sure everything looks correct. And now it's finally time to actually get to sculpting. I move over to the face and the snout and start shaping them into the proper shapes of the face. I'm not really adding super small details yet, I'm just merging the objects together and adding the major planes and the eye sockets and jawbones and all those really important landmarks. I also hide the mane and add a smaller neck just to make sure the proportions work even when the mane is kind of cut short. And then back to the face, I continue tweaking the proportions and adjusting all the landmarks and stuff. This character's face is quite different from other characters I've sculpted, so it took me quite a while to figure out how exactly to make it look appealing in 3D. Right here I think I'm about happy with how it looks, but I'm not so sure, so I move on to something else for a while. I add in a sphere for the shoulders and then just go around looking at different parts of the model and tweaking stuff for a while. I eventually decide to tackle the mane and hair for a while next. I duplicate over the horns and shape them round about how the hair is on the references. Then I apply the mirror modifier on them and just tweak things around a bit since the hair isn't symmetrical. I push and pull it around for a while to make sure it just around about fits the style it kind of has on the references. One side has one long thin strand and the other has a thicker kind of side bang thingy. I don't know the technical terms for all these hair kind of dealio things. I go back to doing some tidbits all over the model here and there, just kind of spinning around and finding something that needs to be tweaked. And then I eventually decide to head back to the face and see if I can now figure out how that's supposed to work. I deepen the eye sockets a bit more. I'm quite happy actually with how the face looks now that the hair is around it. Then I add in the eyeballs with just a regular sphere with a mirror modifier on it. I duplicate them, add a solidify modifier, and use that second piece to sculpt the eyelids. Once I think I'm happy with them, I scroll out and make sure it looks good from multiple different angles and from different distances. And then I head back, duplicate the ears this time, and use it to make some tufts of hair around the cheeks. I use the same technique for all the tufts of hair on this model as I did for my fox that I made a couple of weeks ago. And now it's time for the big adventurous part of this model. I grab some of the tufts from the side of the head and then move them over to the mane and start duplicating them around and changing the shape and thickness and all of that to make the mane all nice and fluffy. This whole process was very repetitive and is technically quite simple. I just grab pieces, duplicate them, and move them around. But in practice it was actually quite complicated to get everything to kind of look right, especially since I specifically didn't want to break the symmetry. Usually with something like this, like fur, you wouldn't want it to look perfectly symmetrical because that kind of looks unrealistic and unappealing. But in this case, I have to retopologize the model, and if I would make it unsymmetrical, that would kind of double or triple the amount of time it takes. And this whole main situation is a nightmare to retopologize as is. I really didn't need any extra work. So off I go on that. There really isn't that much to explain about this process, it's just mostly trial and error. Well, now I've done quite a chunk of the mane, and it's time to move on to something else for a while before I go insane. I tweak the hair a little bit, and then move over to the body for a while. I actually apply a couple of the modifiers, and leave only the mirror modifiers, and start sculpting in more details that you couldn't add with just the skin modifier setup. I also go into sculpt mode on the torso and remesh that and start adding the general shapes of the upper body. Same thing with the shoulders. Then I grab both of the objects that make up the torso and merge them together. That actually causes a couple of problems with my mirror modifier because I had set the mirror object to the bottom part of the torso and that was now gone, so all my modifiers kind of freaked out. Usually it's a bit smarter to make just like an empty object that only exists to support the mirror modifiers on your objects, but I just kind of choose one of the central objects for that because I'm too lazy to add another one. Anyway, I go on and sculpt in some more details. I also mess around with a couple of tufts of fur on some other parts of the body. I actually end up removing those later. I didn't think they added super much. I also add some tufts of hair around the edges of where the arms meet the hands because that's something he has in the reference. Now for the ears, I remesh them and sculpt in the hollow inner part. I also mess around with different ways of adding the little fur to the end, but I end up back at my skin modifier setup, which is kind of my new favorite thing for sculpting, I'm going to be entirely honest. It's a super versatile way to add in more pieces. And now it's back to the face for a little bit. I sculpt in the mouth, and then tweak the hair for a while. And back to the hands. I'm really back and forth, moving between different parts of the model, just kind of scrolling out, seeing if something needs tweaking, and scrolling back in. It's not very good for videos, but I find it's a way more kind of intuitive way to work. If I can't figure out how to continue with one piece, I just move over to another part, and by the time I'm done with that, I've probably found a new idea of how to continue with the whatever I was working on before. Now I focus in on the thighs for a short moment and add in some fur. The character has a bit of like a big tuft of fur going around the sides of the legs, so I add that in again with the same skin modifier setup I've been using for all my fur recently. Now for a bit of a change of pace, for the fur around the edge of the feet, I don't use a skin modifier setup, I use a sphere which I shape into the general shape of the tufts. And some more fur, this time on the hands a little bit and on the sides of the tail. The blocking kind of phase for this model has been really long. I usually don't take nearly as much time, but in this case, with just the amount of kind of fur and hair and stuff like that all over the place, it was really important for me to just spend enough time so that everything works well, so by the time I get to the proper sculpting, I don't have to find myself adding in additional tufts or moving stuff around majorly. Speaking of tufts, I add in some smaller strands to the tail and make that a bit more detailed. Again, just like with the mane and all the other parts, I keep it perfectly symmetrical, but because it's rarely ever visible from directly the top or the bottom, you'll barely even notice it, which is nice. And now for the horns. They're currently just like cylindrical, so I apply all the modifiers and bring up some references of sheep horns and just quickly sculpt in the sharper edges to make them look like sheep horns. Regular sheep horns have a bit more like roughness to them, but the horns on the reference are super smooth and shiny, so I leave them like that. And now, with all the back and forth I've done on the face, I'm actually quite happy with the general shape, so I remesh it and add some more details to it. I also tweak the torso a little bit, add some more details and sharpness to that. I'm really not that great with anatomy, so I struggled with it a little bit. Now I add in a couple of different materials just to make the model more colorful. I'm not doing any vertex paints on this one, so this is about as close as I can get to the colors on the reference without actually painting it, which is something I won't do for the sculpt. I will only paint it properly once I've actually UV unwrapped it and all that, so that's going to be quite a while until that happens. Anyway, back to the face. I finally grabbed the eyelids and merged them with the face. Use Shift R to get my remesh level really high and start kind of smoothing everything out, adding some tighter creases around things like the eyelids, sharpening the eyebrows, smoothing out some stuff like the forehead and all that. And now I apply the modifiers on the tufts of hair on the side of the face, sculpt some sharp edges and stuff onto those, and go back all over the place for a while. And it's eyebrow time. I add in a plane, turn on snapping so it snaps to the surface, add a solidify modifier and some subdivision surface modifiers and even a shrink wrap modifier this time, and just model the eyebrows on to the model. Tweak them a bit so the shape matches the reference and the expression is nice and neutral. Now it's back to making tweaks to all my skin modifiers all over the place. I finally apply the skin modifier for the hair on the front and start sculpting in some more details. At this point I'm still in the process of deciding the exact style I want for the hair. At first I make it quite a bit sharper and more detailed than what I eventually go with. At this point I'm slowly reaching a point in the model where I can't really justify keeping everything in these separate pieces. That's super practical early on when you're still making big changes, but at some point when you start adding more details you just have to merge stuff together. So I do that for the legs. And I sculpt in the knees and the back of the legs and this kind of stuff that I couldn't do when the model is in two pieces. I also add in more tufts of fur on the back. This time I make them in one line so they'll be easier to retopologize later. And I go back to the front and tweak that one little strand of hair I've been working on. You can actually use slash on the numpad to go to local view, meaning you can only see that one object, so you can see it from different sides and all that. That makes it easier to sculpt more details on pieces like this that are otherwise surrounded by a bunch of stuff. And now it's time to finally start sculpting the proper details into the mane. I separate individual parts of my skin modifier setup out using P so I don't do everything at once and potentially mess something up. And I add some more pieces and rearrange them, keeping the symmetry on pieces where it's possible and struggling around with remesh on one spot for some reason. I merged the additional parts to the main chunk I had already added, and remesh again and sculpt in some more sharper edges and more details. I feel like adding just a couple of edges and like flatter planes always makes hair look a bit more like hair-like than just keeping them so cylindrical and smooth, which is weird because like in real life hair doesn't have sharp edges or right angles like that, so I don't know why stylized hair looks so much better with these sharp edges. But it works, so that's how I do it. Now I go to the back. I had originally spaced everything out super evenly, so I go around and like push and pull things together so it gives it a bit more natural, like disorganized look, even though it is still perfectly symmetrical. And I apply my modifiers on individual bits of hair again, arranging them around, especially using my snake hook tool and my crease brush to add in some more creases, smooth stuff out with my smooth brush, and then like using my snake hook to make sure to get them perfectly into place. More rearrangements and tweaks around the back. I really want to make sure they are all arranged perfectly before I start remeshing them together, because at that point I can't make any more changes. I have reached a point where I'm pretty much happy with the arrangement of all my individual strands of hair. So I use P to separate out individual pieces, apply all the modifiers on them, sculpt in some details, remesh them, merge stuff together, and just kind of go with it. Well, that took a while. It's finally time for me to move to something else for a while. I just go around the tufts of fur around different parts of the body and tweak them, like add a couple more extra hairs here and there, and just like move them around until I think the position and shape and everything is right. I also rearrange them a bit so they aren't as evenly spaced and have all the same sizes. I make sure they're clumped together a bit and like just have some variety. And now I go back to the hair out in the front a bit. I make some tweaks to the one hair I've been sculpting for a while to just match it to the style of the mane. Then I apply the modifiers on the other side and sculpt in some more details there. Again, I mainly use the crease brush to add the creases and the sharper edges that are kind of pulled out, and press shift to smooth stuff out, and use my snake hook tool and occasionally like the pose brushes to just move stuff around and tweak it a bit. And I go to the tail and do the whole shtick there too, adding creases and edges and smoothing stuff out and moving stuff around and stuff till it all looks good. I also add a couple of more little pieces of hair here and there just to make stuff look a bit more like rough around the edges and chaotic rather than super smooth and, let's say, well kempt. Because the reference of the character gives me a bit more like messy, chaotic vibes in terms of the hair and the mane. And now it's time to set my sights on the arms. I apply some modifiers, apply some like parenting and stuff like that, and tweak things here and there, tweak the hands especially, and then move on to the arms themselves. I merge the upper arm and the shoulder together, remesh that, and start sculpting in some more detail. I also tweak the torso a little bit while I'm there. And now I sculpt in my details to the hair that I made around the sides of the legs. And I also add some more detail to all the fur around the lower legs and feet, as well as the tail. I also go up to the ears and merge the little tufts of hair to the main ear and smooth everything out, add some creases and stuff to make that look all nice and smooth. I also go out and tweak the face for a little bit one last time, and I merge the hairs that I added to the side into the main head and add a bit more detail to them too. And now back onto the arms. I take my little tufts of hair on the edges and merge them with the main part of the lower arm, and like sculpt them in, smooth out all the transitions and stuff, and I realize I just don't have enough hair for it to make sense. I just have the edges kind of filled out, which on its own doesn't really work. So I go back into object mode, grab a couple of spheres, add them in and stretch them out to make them have the proper shape for little tufts of hair. Once I'm happy with all their like arrangement and their shape, I remesh them to sculpt in a little bit more detail. Then I connect them all, or I join them all to the main arm mesh and remesh that all with Ctrl J to join and Shift R and Ctrl R to remesh. Then I go back around really mainly with my crease brush to add some more creases, or press Ctrl to add edges, like sharper edges and stuff like that, and I press Shift to smooth stuff out also. I continue to make tweaks around the arms and all of that good stuff. I add a bit more detail to the hand, try and figure out the position of the fingers, how that's exactly supposed to look, because that wasn't really something I was paying a whole lot of attention to earlier. I go back down to the lower leg, grab all the little tufts of hair, merge them with it, and smooth them out, add more detail. I kind of approach them in the exact same way I did the arms earlier, adding in a couple more spears for extra tufts of hair where I felt like they were missing. I also add a couple of pieces of fur to the back of his calves just to make those a bit more interesting. They were kind of too smooth and empty before. Now I move over to the tail, quickly remesh the individual tufts of fur I'd made, and then grab the main part of the tail and just put everything together and remesh that. Add a couple of more lines and creases and put everything together. I also occasionally use the sharp mesh filter just to smooth out and crease the result of my remeshing. Now I go to the main part of the tail and repeat the same process, adding the fur and stuff to it. I also add in like a bit of a transition between the tufts of fur and the main tail. And now for the legs. I muster up the courage to join all the objects together and remesh them and like smooth out all the transitions and stuff like that. I also go to where the leg fur starts and sculpt in some smaller chunks of fur to smooth out and like just make the transition look nicer. Now I also take the two pieces of the arms and remesh that together and just make sure all the individual parts of the model are looking good. And it's time for the final remesh. There isn't really much I can do to the individual parts of the body anymore at this point, so I grab all of them, join them with Ctrl J, and remesh them to make one big, very high poly, full sculpt kind of thing. I mask out individual parts of the object because it's just kind of too high poly to work with, and I make them into face sets, so that way I can just hover over a part and press H to view only that part, so that way I don't have to look at 10 million polys at the same time, because that would just be a bit too hard on my PC and it makes everything really slow. So by just focusing in on one piece at a time, I can just smooth out all those little transitions and all that without dying. And now I go over to the head and essentially do the same thing. I grab the entirety of the mane and all like the pieces of hair and stuff around it and the ears and merge them to the head. Again, remeshing at a really high resolution to make sure I don't lose any details and I can just smooth out all the transitions and all that. I leave the horns and the eyes and the eyebrows and stuff separate for now because that makes stuff easier for the retopology. I also leave the front hair separate because that's the only part of this whole model that's asymmetrical, so that needs to be separate up until the really latest point I can afford. I'm probably even going to leave them separate for the final model. Now I go back in, just all around the model, finding little parts that still need like tweaking and refining and just doing those. Adding more detail, smoothing stuff out, and just all around making sure everything looks about right. I also duplicate the eyebrows and give him some eyelashes. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with them later on during retopology and all that for the final model, but for now I felt he should have some. At this point the model is pretty much in its final state, and I just continue to go around, make sure everything is nice and polished and the way I want it to be. I also tweak the parts of the model that aren't visible because they're like in between two separate loose parts, and just try some stuff around with them. Not everything works out well, but that's okay. And with some tweaks and the final few details, the sculpt part of this model is finally done. And here it is, the final sculpt. I'm really happy with how it looks so far, and the client is happy too, which is always good. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a multiple part series, so the retopology is going to be out soon, hopefully. Maybe not next week, but hopefully like in 2 weeks or something. I've already started and it's taking quite a while, and I have a couple of other things I need to do this week, so I might not be able to spend a huge amount of time on it. Either way, so far I've been having a lot of fun. This is a really cool character and I enjoy working on them. And as I said, I'm really happy with how this part of the sculpt turned out. If you have a character and you'd like me to model or paint them, I have my commission info linked in the description below. That being said, as of making this video, I actually have a bit of a queue, so it might be a while till I get to anything new. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and maybe learned a thing or two from it, or just like got inspiration for your own character art and like sculpting and all that good stuff. And I hope to see you guys again for next week's video. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and maybe check out one of my other videos to the right. If you'd like to see more of my art or maybe get a commission from me, I've put links to all that in the description below. And I've also put a link to the Discord server. Anyway, I hope you have a nice day and see you all next time.